I collapsed in the street, my body hitting the cold asphalt like a rag doll tossed aside, the sharp sting of gravel biting into my palms and knees, while the cacophony of the city continued around me as if I were invisible. Car horns blared, strangers shouted at each other, and the neon lights from the storefronts reflected off the wet pavement, turning the chaos into a surreal blur of colors that made my head spin and my stomach turn. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with panic, my vision swimming in and out of focus, and every attempt to rise was thwarted by trembling legs and a mind that refused to process the magnitude of everything I had just endured. Just hours ago, I had walked into what was supposed to be a celebratory evening, expecting family and acquaintances to acknowledge the hard work, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices I had made to reach this point in my life, only to be met with laughter, mockery, and deliberate humiliation designed to remind me that in their eyes, I would always be beneath them. And yet, here I was, sprawled on a city street, utterly exposed, the weight of betrayal pressing on me from every direction, wondering if I would ever be able to rise again, not just physically, but emotionally, socially, and spiritually. It was then, in the blur of streetlights and muffled voices, that I felt a pair of eyes on me, unflinching, intense, and strangely grounding, belonging to a stranger whose presence seemed to cut through the chaos and the noise, holding me suspended between despair and the faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone was seeing me for more than my humiliation. When I finally dared to open my eyes, the stranger was closer than I had realized, their gaze sharp and unwavering, and for a moment I felt like a cornered animal, wary, tense, ready to flinch or retreat, unsure if this person had come to mock me like everyone else, or if there was a possibility of help buried beneath the stoic expression and the quiet authority they radiated. Their voice, when it came, was calm, measured, and deliberate, cutting through the din of the city like a beacon. "Take my hand." I hesitated, heart pounding, chest heaving with the raw exhaustion of emotional and physical collapse, and yet something in the tone, the unyielding certainty that I could trust them, even if only for this brief instant, forced my trembling hand to accept theirs. The warmth of that hand anchored me, pulling me upright not just physically but mentally, challenging the narrative I had been forced to live under for months, the narrative that I was weak, unworthy, disposable, a source of entertainment for those who should have been my family. Step by step, they guided me toward the nearest cafe, their presence both a shield and a mirror, reflecting the parts of me I had long tried to hide, the dignity that had been buried beneath humiliation and fear, and yet, in that quiet act of connection, I felt the first flicker of clarity in weeks, the realization that I could survive, that I could exist beyond the cruel laughter and whispered judgments, and that my story was far from over. Inside the cafe, the smell of coffee, baked bread, and the muted warmth of ambient light was a stark contrast to the harshness of the streets outside. I could feel every eye in the room, some curious, some judgmental, but the stranger's presence created a protective bubble around me, a small but vital space where I could begin to breathe without anticipating ridicule or dismissal at every moment. They motioned for me to stay silent, while they ordered something for both of us, and I allowed myself a long, shuddering exhale, feeling the weight of weeks, months, and years of humiliation and neglect press down on me, only to gradually lift as the stranger's calm steadiness reminded me that I was capable, resilient, and deserving of care. I found myself telling fragments of my story in broken sentences, the words catching in my throat as I recounted the betrayal of my family, the cruel jokes told in my presence as if I were invisible, the pointed laughter of friends who should have celebrated my achievements, and the deep, gnawing exhaustion of pretending to be strong while everyone around me seemed determined to undermine my sense of worth. With each word, the stranger nodded, never interrupting, never judging, and never offering hollow reassurance, and I began to realize that simply being seen, truly witnessed in my most vulnerable state, was the first step toward reclaiming the power and dignity that had been stripped away so methodically and deliberately. Hours seemed to pass in minutes as I sat there, recounting, reliving, and processing everything I had endured while the stranger listened, grounding me with small gestures, a gentle touch on the shoulder, a guiding hand toward the window when the world outside threatened to intrude. I could feel the anger building, simmering beneath the surface, not reckless or destructive, but sharp, focused, and ready to be channeled. For the first time since the incident, I wasn't shaking from fear or despair, I was trembling with the raw energy of determination, with the realization that every humiliation, every betrayal, every mocking word could be transformed into strategy, into action, into the reclamation of my life on my own terms. I realized that I had been invisible not because I lacked power, but because I had allowed others to define me, to dictate the terms of my existence, to measure my value through their cruelty rather than my own integrity and intelligence. This realization hit harder than any slap, any insult, any public degradation, because it made clear that the path forward was mine to command, mine to design, and mine to execute. By the time I stood to leave the cafe, the sky was pale with the approach of dawn, and the city felt different, not hostile, not indifferent, but full of potential, as if every insult and every slight had prepared me for this moment of clarity, this moment of awakening. The stranger walked beside me silently, never pushing, never leading, allowing me to navigate the streets at my own pace, and in that quiet companionship, I felt a resolve harden within me. I would not only survive, I would thrive, and I would confront every humiliation, every betrayal, and every person who thought they had the power to diminish me with a precision and intelligence that would leave them stunned. And as we parted, just outside my apartment building, the stranger's parting words echoed in my mind: "You're stronger than they will ever understand, and they will see it one day." I didn't respond, because I didn't need to. The weight of my humiliation was still there, the sting of betrayal still raw, but somewhere beneath it all, a spark had ignited, a spark that promised that the next time the world tried to push me down, I would rise with a force that no one could ignore, no one could mock, and no one could control. The next morning, I woke to the soft hum of the city outside my window, sunlight piercing through the blinds and painting stripes across the floor, yet the warmth of the day did little to soothe the ache in my chest or erase the image of my family's laughter from the night before. Each snicker, each whispered jab, each pointed glance replayed in my mind like a cruel film, and I realized that this wasn't just about embarrassment, it was about control, about them asserting dominance, about reminding me in the most public, the most cutting way, that in their world, I was beneath them. I dressed carefully, deliberately, choosing clothing that reflected the dignity I refused to surrender, the quiet assertion that while they had attempted to humiliate me, they would not dictate how I moved through the world or how I presented myself. Every fold of fabric, every carefully chosen accessory, every subtle detail became armor, a shield against the echoes of derision that still clung to me, haunting the corners of my mind. As I left my apartment, the streets felt different this time, not indifferent, not chaotic, but almost conspiratorial, as if the city itself were aligned with me, offering an invisible stage for a reclamation that would not be passive or subtle, but deliberate and precise. I found myself walking past the places where I had once lingered, where the city's energy had often mirrored my anxiety and self-doubt, and each familiar landmark now felt like a silent witness, reminding me of how far I had come and how much I had endured. I stopped at a small cafe I had frequented in quieter days, its faded awning and cracked windows offering comfort in their imperfection, a place untouched by the opulence and judgment that had defined the night of my humiliation. I ordered a coffee, black and bitter, the taste grounding me, and I sat by the window, watching people move past, unaware of the storm that had passed through my life and the slow, deliberate rebuilding that had begun. It was in these moments of quiet observation that I began to strategize, mentally retracing the steps of my family, their arrogance, their misjudgments, and every small crack in their facade that I had witnessed over the years but had never fully exploited. My mind, once clouded with shame and confusion, now buzzed with clarity and purpose, calculating, predicting, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation that would not merely restore my dignity but assert it in a way that could not be ignored, laughed at, or diminished. By the time I left the cafe, I had sketched an invisible blueprint in my mind, a plan not of revenge in its base form, but of reclamation, a careful orchestration that would turn every public slight into an opportunity to demonstrate not just my survival but my dominance over the narrative they had tried to control. Each step on the cracked pavement felt weighted with intention, each breath drawn with purpose, as I rehearsed every interaction, every expression, every subtle signal that could shift the perception of those who had sought to humiliate me. I imagined their surprise, the incredulous silence, the subtle shift in the room's energy when they realized that the person they had mocked and underestimated was now the architect of the unfolding reality, the one commanding attention, respect, and authority, without ever raising my voice or stooping to vulgarity. This mental rehearsal was not just preparation, it was the reclaiming of my agency, the sharpening of a weapon forged in the crucible of humiliation, and as I stepped onto the bus that would take me to the university, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a calm born from clarity, strategy, and a growing sense of inevitability that I would not be denied my due. Arriving at the university, I was acutely aware of every familiar face, every corner that had once seemed intimidating, every shadow that had previously harbored whispers or judgment. The reception hall loomed ahead, a grand stage of chandeliers, polished floors, and the soft murmur of well-dressed guests, all of whom believed they were poised to witness a continuation of my public shaming. But I was no longer the same person who had entered this room the night before. The weight of humiliation had been transmuted into resolve, the sting of laughter replaced by a precise, cold awareness that every eye in this room would soon recognize who truly commanded respect and dignity. I moved through the crowd with a deliberate, unhurried grace, smiling politely, nodding subtly, acknowledging acquaintances without revealing the storm brewing beneath the surface, the careful orchestration of observation, patience, and timing that would ensure that when I acted, the effect would be total, undeniable, and irreversible. I watched my family from across the room, noting the subtle glances they exchanged, the barely restrained smirks that had once filled me with panic now sharpening my focus. I noted my sister's friends, who had so gleefully joined in the mockery, their laughter still echoing in my memory, and I catalogued their positions, their social dynamics, and the assumptions they were making about me. Every detail became ammunition, every observation a key to dismantling the carefully constructed illusion of superiority they relied upon. I understood that I could not simply confront them in a rash or emotional way. The power I sought was in precision, in letting the universe and their own arrogance do most of the work while I remained the calm, intelligent center, the pivot around which the narrative would shift irreversibly. As the reception continued, the mingling crowd became my landscape, each conversation, each gesture, each laugh mapped and interpreted, and I allowed myself a quiet, controlled smile as I saw the first cracks in the facade begin to appear. A friend of my sister looked at me, expecting hesitation or shame, and was met instead with poise, confidence, and a faint, knowing sparkle in my eyes. The effect was subtle but profound. In these small, almost imperceptible moments, I began to feel the shift in energy, the subtle acknowledgement that I was no longer a subject to be ridiculed, but an observer, a strategist, a force whose timing would soon render every slight irrelevant, every mockery impotent. By the end of the evening, I was fully immersed in the controlled chaos of the reception, moving seamlessly among guests, projecting warmth and elegance while mentally tracing the patterns of power, the hidden vulnerabilities, and the blind spots that had allowed my family's cruelty to take root. I felt a growing sense of satisfaction, not in vengeance, but in the clarity that the next act, the carefully timed reveal of my intelligence, dignity, and composure, would ensure that the tables had not just turned, they would remain overturned, leaving no space for doubt, derision, or the illusion that they could ever humiliate me again. As the evening deepened, the warm glow of chandeliers bounced off polished surfaces, reflecting not just light but the careful illusions my family had woven around themselves. I moved among the crowd like a ghost of composure, a calm presence in a room brimming with chatter, laughter, and the faint hum of pretentious pride. Every eye that had mocked me the night before, every smirk and hushed whisper, seemed magnified under my scrutiny. I studied them as a strategist studies a battlefield, tracking body language, tone, and the subtle interplay of power that they believed they wielded effortlessly. But I knew the truth: their laughter was hollow, their arrogance brittle, and their sense of invincibility built on the assumption that I was powerless, that I had nowhere to rise from, nowhere to strike back from. They had miscalculated. They always did. I found a small corner by the window, ostensibly lost in thought, but in reality, my mind was a meticulous map of the reception hall. I noted the positioning of my sister's friends, who had laughed with such delight at my public embarrassment. Their voices, too loud, too certain, too unaware, they revealed more than they intended. I catalogued each flaw, each overconfidence, each misplaced assumption. The waiter passing by offered me a smile, oblivious to the undercurrents of silent retribution swirling through my awareness. Every gesture of mine was deliberate, measured, unremarkable to the casual observer, but loaded with intent. My family, so preoccupied with their own revelry, would not notice the subtle currents of power shifting around them, the seeds of embarrassment I was planting that would grow silently until their undoing was complete. When my sister approached, radiant in her cap and gown, flanked by friends and admirers, I allowed myself a soft, controlled sigh. The warmth of the congratulations they all lavished upon her contrasted sharply with the shadow I had felt looming over me the previous night, a shadow built from scorn, laughter, and public humiliation. I greeted her politely, bowing slightly in a gesture of civility, and her eyes flickered with confusion for the briefest instant. She had expected fear, hesitation, or anger from me, emotions that would have been obvious and exploitable, but she saw only calm, poise, and the quiet gleam of someone who had recalculated the rules of the game. I could see the discomfort beginning, a flicker of doubt crossing her features as the realization hit her: the sister she had intended to diminish, to mock, and to control was now an entirely different force, deliberate, poised, and impenetrable. Across the room, a cluster of her friends, previously gleeful in their ridicule, were slowly being drawn into my orbit of influence. I smiled politely at a group, acknowledging them with grace, my voice light and cordial, my posture relaxed but commanding. The subtle shift was almost imperceptible, but it was there, a change in their perception, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps the game was no longer theirs to play. They glanced at each other, uncertain, sensing without knowing why that the woman they had laughed at so openly was now the one orchestrating the rhythm of the room, the subtle flow of energy, and the focus of attention. I let them stew in that uncertainty, allowing it to grow, savoring the small victory that was as precise as it was invisible. I found myself walking toward the buffet, the polished floors cool under my heels, and I noticed how the servers moved past me with polite efficiency, unaware that I had observed their every action with care. This attention to detail, this awareness, was part of the power I wielded quietly. The very elements of the room that my family had assumed were neutral, the lights, the tables, the flow of guests, were now instruments of my subtle dominance. I was aware of my every gesture, my every smile, my every glance, and the way it reverberated through the crowd without seeming intentional. By controlling my presence, I controlled perception, and perception, I knew, was the true currency of influence, far more enduring than anger or confrontation. As speeches began, I positioned myself strategically near the podium, not in the center, not in the obvious line of attention, but where I could observe, anticipate, and subtly assert influence. My sister's proud smile was still in place, her friends' laughter restrained now by the awareness that something had shifted, though they could not articulate what. I noted the lecturer's gestures, the way the microphone caught the tone of each speaker, and I calculated the exact moment when the focus could be redirected, when the narrative of ridicule could be replaced with the undeniable truth of my competence, elegance, and composure. Every word spoken, every gesture made by my family, became fodder for the inevitable realization they would face: their assumptions about me, their belief in their superiority, were entirely misplaced. By the time the ceremony moved toward its conclusion, I had orchestrated my presence with surgical precision. Conversations that might have spiraled into further embarrassment were subtly redirected, interactions carefully guided, and my family, for the first time that evening, began to sense that they had lost control. The laughter that had once echoed so cruelly at my expense was now tentative, unsure, laced with the first hints of self-consciousness. I allowed a small, private smile to grace my lips, not in arrogance, but in satisfaction, an acknowledgement of the invisible work done, the subtle, quiet victories gained without a single raised voice or dramatic confrontation. The night was still young, but the first act of reclamation was complete, and I could feel the growing awareness in my family and her friends that the balance of power had shifted, and it had shifted irreversibly. The room had grown warmer, the chatter more strained, and every laugh seemed to echo like a reminder of the events that had led me here. I could feel the eyes on me, some curious, some suspicious, and others unaware of the undercurrent of power I was now asserting. My family's smug confidence wavered ever so slightly with every subtle gesture I made, every quiet interaction I orchestrated without drawing attention. I moved among the tables with a measured elegance, observing, listening, absorbing. The very way my fingers brushed against a glass or the tilt of my head when acknowledging someone's comment became an assertion, a silent declaration that I had regained control. Those who had once thought of me as weak or submissive now unconsciously deferred, adjusting their posture, their tone, their mannerisms, as if sensing a presence far stronger than they anticipated. I paused near a group of my sister's friends, who were still whispering and exchanging amused glances about my previous humiliation. They did not yet know that the narrative had changed completely. I offered a polite, almost imperceptible smile to each of them, acknowledging their presence without revealing the quiet storm brewing behind my eyes. That smile alone unsettled them. It was not a smile of fear, not a smile of revenge, but a smile that suggested control, clarity, and absolute calm. In that moment, I realized that the true power lay not in confrontation but in observation, in patience, in letting others reveal their assumptions while you silently dismantle them. Every laugh, every casual remark, every attempt to assert superiority was now fodder for the eventual reckoning I had carefully staged in my mind over the past months. As the speeches continued, I noticed the lecturer adjusting his notes, the subtle twitch in the microphone stand, the way the spotlight shifted across the room. Every detail mattered. I positioned myself perfectly to witness, to guide, and to control the perception of those around me. When my sister's friends attempted to make eye contact, I returned it with composed intensity, forcing a flicker of uncertainty to cross their faces. That hesitation was enough. They began to second-guess their judgments, their whispered jokes faltering mid-air as they sensed a subtle, inescapable authority in my presence. I had become the invisible force, the quiet center of gravity that they could not ignore, even as they tried desperately to maintain their facade of dominance and amusement. I took a deep breath and allowed my mind to wander briefly to the night that had brought me here, the embarrassment, the cruel jokes, the public humiliation. Each memory sharpened my resolve rather than weakening it. The sting of laughter, the sudden sense of isolation, the judgment of friends and strangers alike, all of it had been fuel, a fire that transformed into something precise and controlled. The elegance of my response, the quiet reclamation of power, was now a lesson in patience and discipline. I understood, more clearly than ever, that true authority was earned through composure, observation, and timing rather than through spectacle or anger. And in that realization, I found both satisfaction and a renewed sense of purpose. Across the room, my family remained unaware of the shifting dynamics. Their laughter, though still present, began to falter when a well-placed compliment or a confident gesture of mine subtly redirected attention. My sister, radiant and oblivious, leaned into the moment as if the event were still hers to command, but even she could not fully ignore the subtle dominance I projected. Every interaction I orchestrated was deliberate, a courteous nod, a poised movement toward a conversation, a brief but commanding gaze. The small adjustments, imperceptible to most, were the scaffolding of my silent victory. By the time the dessert course was announced, I had mapped out every social movement, every potential pitfall, every opportunity to assert control without raising my voice or overtly confronting anyone. I moved to a vantage point near the entrance, observing the ebb and flow of guests as they mingled, laughed, and occasionally glanced in my direction. Each glance carried a fragment of uncertainty, a fleeting recognition that the woman they had mocked was no longer the same. I could see the seeds of hesitation taking root in their expressions, the subtle recalibration of assumptions. It was poetic, a quiet, slow-motion unraveling of the arrogance that had once seemed untouchable. And yet, the moment was not yet complete. There remained one final act, one calculated culmination of observation, strategy, and silent power that would solidify the reversal of fortune and the ultimate reclamation of dignity. The anticipation was almost tangible, a quiet tension weaving through the room, though none but I could perceive it. Every word spoken, every toast raised, every casual gesture had become a thread in the intricate tapestry of retribution and reclamation. The lessons learned from past humiliations, the patience, the observation, the careful orchestration of perception, had all led to this point. I felt a sense of serene satisfaction as I realized that the culmination of my quiet power was near, that the narrative of humiliation was about to invert in a way that was both inevitable and inescapable. For the first time, I was not merely reacting to the past, I was shaping the present, bending perception and expectation to my will with precision, grace, and unshakable composure. The moment I had been orchestrating for months had arrived, though to everyone else in the room it looked like nothing more than a quiet, elegant woman attending a reception. My family, so confident in their control, had no idea that every smile, every nod, every gesture I had made had been a calculated signal, a breadcrumb trail of silent power. I approached the podium under the guise of helping with a minor detail, the microphone brushing against my fingers as I adjusted it with precision. All eyes turned subtly toward me, and I allowed the room to absorb the small authority I projected. It was not arrogance, it was control, the calm awareness that I had rewritten the rules of engagement without uttering a single harsh word. In that instant, I saw the flicker of recognition in my sister's friends' eyes. They finally realized that the person they had mocked was no longer vulnerable, no longer intimidated, no longer defined by past humiliation. The laughter that had once tormented me now felt distant, irrelevant. I watched the subtle shifts in posture, the faltering confidence, the brief hesitations that betrayed uncertainty. I had turned the room into a chessboard, every move anticipated, every reaction noted, every opportunity accounted for. My family's smugness, their assumption of dominance, crumbled in imperceptible ways as I executed my final maneuvers. I allowed a polite smile to touch my lips, a gesture that seemed simple but carried the weight of months of preparation, years of patience, and countless private moments of resolve. Every guest in that room was now caught between what they thought they knew about me and the reality of the composed, capable woman standing before them. I reached for the envelope on the table, a simple piece of paper that contained the final confirmation of what I had already orchestrated, the public acknowledgement of my achievements, my authority, and my regained dignity. The room leaned in without realizing it, the subtle magnetism of control drawing attention in a way that was invisible but undeniable. As I spoke, my voice calm, poised, and clear, I allowed the story of my life, the hardships, the humiliations, the quiet resilience, to unfold. Not a single word of bitterness escaped, but every syllable carried the weight of justice served. My sister's friends, once so eager to laugh at my expense, now listened, caught in the grip of admiration, respect, and the undeniable reality that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. I paused, letting the room absorb the quiet triumph. The people who had underestimated me, who had assumed that my meekness or compliance would define me forever, now faced a version of me that was unassailable, untouchable, and infinitely composed. My family exchanged glances, the arrogance they had carried like armor now faltering, replaced with the recognition that their assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable, the energy electric but contained. I smiled, a soft, measured expression, knowing that the humiliation I had endured for years had transformed into power that did not need to be boasted, shouted, or displayed. It simply existed, undeniable and immutable. The final moment came subtly but unmistakably. A toast, initiated by someone else but seized by me in timing, allowed me to claim the narrative with effortless grace. I spoke of perseverance, of dignity, of reclaiming one's life quietly but absolutely. Every eye was on me, every ear attentive, every heart forced to acknowledge the authority I had quietly established. The laughter that had once sought to diminish me was gone, replaced by hushed admiration and a newfound respect that needed no proclamation. My family's smug control was shattered, not by confrontation, but by the quiet, precise execution of patience, observation, and strategic grace. As I stepped away from the podium, the room seemed altered, charged with a new understanding. I had not merely survived humiliation, I had transformed it into a demonstration of undeniable competence, grace, and authority. The people who had once sought to define me by their mockery now recognized, consciously or unconsciously, that the script had changed and that I was the one holding the pen. My sister's friends exchanged glances, no longer sure of their assumptions, no longer confident in their superiority, and it was in that space, in that fragile tension, that my quiet victory was sealed. Walking toward the exit, I felt a clarity I had never known before. The humiliation, the shame, the forced smiles, the subtle jeers, they were all tools in the crafting of my ultimate reclamation. I did not need applause, acknowledgement, or confrontation. The world had witnessed the shift in power, and that was enough. I stepped out into the cool evening air, the weight lifted, the control absolute. The city lights shimmered, but they were nothing compared to the illumination within me. In that moment, I knew that humiliation could be transformed into empowerment, mockery into strategy, and silence into a weapon more precise and more effective than any scream of retaliation. And as I disappeared into the night, I carried with me the unshakable knowledge that true victory does not demand spectacle, it demands patience, precision, and an unwavering commitment to reclaiming one's dignity, no matter how public the humiliation. The moment I stepped back into the hall, my chest still ached from the shame and humiliation of the earlier moments. I realized something had shifted. The laughter that once pierced me like icy daggers no longer carried the same power. My eyes, scanning the crowd, saw the faint flickers of recognition and doubt forming in the faces of those who had mocked me. The same people who had whispered and pointed, their smug grins frozen in the memory of their cruelty, were now unsure, hesitant, and subtly off balance. I moved deliberately through the room, my posture tall and deliberate, each step measured, my heels clicking like a metronome of authority that demanded attention. I could hear the murmur of conversations falter as I passed, and in that faltering, I felt the first taste of justice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniably mine. I caught the eye of my sister, her expression unreadable, a mixture of surprise and something that almost looked like fear. I remembered every slight, every joke at my expense, every whispered insult that had made me feel small in this hall of pretentious smiles. But now, with every calculated movement, every carefully maintained expression of calm, I could feel the scales tipping back in my favor. My mind raced, not with anger, but with strategy, with a deep understanding that this event was no longer theirs to control. I could see the tiny cracks forming in their armor, the first signs that their carefully constructed facade of superiority was beginning to crumble. And I smiled, just slightly, a quiet acknowledgement to myself that the long game, the patient and precise preparation I had maintained for months, was finally coming to fruition. I moved closer to the table where the professors and key alumni were seated, making sure my presence was noticed, a silent assertion that I belonged here just as much as anyone, if not more. I could feel the electricity in the air, a subtle tension that spoke of shifting power dynamics, and I reveled in it. Every glance directed my way carried a new curiosity, a cautious respect mingled with disbelief. They had expected me to shrink, to vanish into the shadows of embarrassment, but instead, I had become a presence impossible to ignore. I could see whispers circulating, quick glances exchanged, questions forming in their minds about how I had transformed from the person they thought they knew into someone unshakable and composed. And it wasn't just about them, it was about me reclaiming my own narrative, rewriting the story that they had tried to write over my life. Every detail mattered, the tilt of my chin, the measured pace of my steps, the calmness in my eyes. I allowed them to notice, allowed them to sense the quiet confidence that radiated from me, and in that allowance, I felt the last vestiges of humiliation dissolve. I had not raised my voice, I had not demanded acknowledgement, I had let my presence, my poise, my unspoken dignity speak for me. And as I passed, I caught the subtle shift in the atmosphere, a recognition that I was no longer the girl they could mock without consequence. The murmurs followed me like shadows, but they were no longer cutting, they were tentative, uncertain, and that uncertainty belonged to me now. Every table I passed offered a new set of challenges, each interaction a microcosm of the larger power struggle I had orchestrated without anyone realizing it. One of my sister's friends, a woman who had been particularly cruel, offered me a strained smile as I moved by. I returned it with perfect composure, acknowledging her presence but withholding any warmth or familiarity. The shift in her expression was immediate, confusion, a hint of fear, and the undeniable realization that the dynamic had changed. I could see it in the way she straightened, how her eyes darted away quickly, how her laughter no longer carried the sharp edge it once had. It was poetic, almost elegant in its precision. I allowed myself a silent nod of satisfaction, internalizing the power that came from restraint, from control, from letting the world see my strength without me announcing it with grand gestures. Every step, every glance, every pause was calculated to remind them that humiliation could be turned into an instrument of dominance when wielded with intelligence and patience. And as I reached the center of the room, I felt a quiet thrill of anticipation, knowing that the moment I had prepared for, the moment when they would finally realize that they could not touch me, was approaching. I glanced at my sister, her expression a complex blend of irritation and disbelief, and for the first time in months, I felt no anger toward her. She had made her choices, aligned herself with the mockery and cruelty, and she would bear the consequences of her actions. I had no need to confront her directly. My presence, my poise, and my unwavering dignity were already speaking volumes. It was a form of silent vengeance that needed no theatrics, no dramatics, only the simple, unassailable power of being unbroken. I could feel the tension in the room solidify as people noticed my every move, their whispers growing more frequent, their eyes involuntarily following me as I navigated the space with deliberate ease. And then it happened, the moment that would crystallize everything I had endured, everything I had planned, and everything I had patiently cultivated. The head professor, who had earlier looked at me dismissively, now offered a genuine nod of acknowledgement as I passed by. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible, but it carried the weight of validation. I absorbed it quietly, savoring it internally, letting it resonate within me as a confirmation that the narrative had shifted. I had reclaimed my space, my dignity, and my authority without uttering a single word, and the realization that this silent reclamation was irreversible filled me with a quiet, powerful triumph. By the time I approached the stage, the room had begun to transform. The laughter that once defined the environment had faded into uneasy murmurs, and the mocking energy that had hung over me like a physical weight was now dissipating. I stood there, poised and ready, every muscle in my body aligned with purpose, every thought focused, every breath controlled. The hall felt charged with anticipation, though none of the attendees knew it yet. My sister's friends, the very people who had tried to diminish me, now looked on with a mixture of envy, curiosity, and the subtle beginnings of respect. And it was here, in this quiet but profound moment, that I realized the truth of my own power, that strength does not always announce itself with thunderous proclamations. Sometimes it is found in calm, deliberate, measured presence, in the ability to let the world catch up to the force that has been quietly growing within. And as I stepped fully onto the stage, the lighting catching the subtle highlights of my hair and the determined set of my jaw, I understood that I had arrived. Not just at the podium, but at the culmination of months of strategy, of patience, of silent endurance and quiet observation. And in this arrival, there was nothing left for them to mock, nothing left for them to undermine, and everything left for me to claim. The applause was hesitant at first, almost perfunctory, but as I raised my head and scanned the room, taking in the faces of my family, my sister, and her friends, I could see the shift crystallizing. Eyes widened, jaws tightened, and even the most arrogant among them hesitated, unsure of how to respond to the woman who had once been their target but now radiated undeniable control and authority. I stepped forward, my voice measured, calm, but carrying every ounce of the power I had accrued in the weeks of preparation. The words were few, deliberate, and precise, each syllable resonating with clarity. And with each phrase, I felt the weight of humiliation lifting, replaced by the exhilarating certainty that the world would now see me on my terms, not theirs. My sister's friends who had laughed earlier now looked uneasy, recognizing the full measure of what they had underestimated. The tables had turned, and the realization settled in their expressions with a subtle, almost poetic justice that required no exaggeration. They had seen the calm, calculated woman who could endure mockery and transform it into triumph, and there was nothing they could do to reverse it. I finished the event with grace, leaving behind an impression that would linger, a story whispered in awe and subtle fear, and as I exited the hall, the city lights spilling onto my path, I felt the last remnants of the shame dissolve entirely. I had reclaimed everything: the narrative, the respect, the dignity, and the silent, precise nature of my victory ensured it would be remembered far longer than any fleeting laughter. That night, the world was mine, not through spectacle, not through shouting, but through patience, intelligence, and the unshakable power of remaining composed while those who sought to demean me discovered that control could be quietly, devastatingly absolute. And as I walked into the night, I knew, without doubt, that nothing, not even my family's cruelty, could touch me again.